Check, hey, 1, 2, mic check, 1, 2. 3, 4, check, mic check, 1, 2. Mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4, hey, check, 1, 2. Mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4, test, hey, check, 1, 2. Mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4, check, hey, 1, 2, 1, 2. Thank you. Check, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, test, hey, check, 1, 2. 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, test, hey, 1, 2. Mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, test, hey, check, 1, 2, 1, 2.
Yeah, okay, guys, take your seats, please. We're going to get started. I think. Please. Kate Dickerson. Welcome to the next panel, which is going to be looking at concepts of truth, which can vary sort of by person by person. After the last discussion we had, I guess we realize how elastic truth is to many people. And journalists, of course, and filmmakers bring also different perspectives to what kind of truth it is that they're seeking and how do they attain it, how do they represent it. And so here to explore some of that with our panelists is Frank Foer. Frank Foer is a journalist. He's former editor of The New Republic. He's also the 2012 Bernard L. Schwartz Fellow at the New America Foundation as of September 2011. He writes for Slate and has written for New York Magazine. He also served as editor of American Magazine and of The New Republic from 2006 to 2010, and then came back again in 2012. He's the author of How Soccer Explains the World, which was published in 2004, and his more recent book is called Jewish Jocks. He co-edited with Mark Tracy, and it was published in 2012, and he's described it as an effort to avoid the simple hagiography he found in some of the many existing books on Jewish sports figures. He's also a very dear and great personal friend, and I'm so glad to welcome him here.
Thank you. So we basically have an essay question at a film school assigned to us today for the topic of our conversation, which goes off of a quote from the great documentarian and feature filmmaker Werner Herzog, who described a concept of ecstatic truth, and he was arguing that that film had the capability of achieving ecstatic truth, which I suppose is a contrast to a sort of more positivistic, journalistic, sort of just the facts truth. And that in order to get at this ecstatic truth, the filmmakers had to take certain narrative risks, and even, it seems like, maybe even evidentiary risks in trying to achieve it. And ecstatic is it's a strange word. It's a religious word. It's a sexual word. It's about what happens when you leap away from logic and you're in this emotional state. And so we're going to kick around this concept, and we have the near platonic ideal of a panel to do that. Jim Solomon was a screenwriter who wrote the screenplay for The Bronx is Burning, which was an incredible exploration of New York in the 1970s, about the New York Yankees and about all of the chaos of that magical season of the blackout, and has this last year unveiled a new film called Witness, which is about the Kitty Genovese murder from the 1960s, also set in New York. And then we have Lee Steinberg, who co-directed the outstanding documentary about the Twitter-happy former Congressman Anthony Weiner on his ultimately quixotic bid to become mayor of New York City. And Caitlin Dickerson, who's just joined the New York Times, who comes by way of NPR, and who is kind of the journalistic conscience of this panel. She's uncovered incredibly important stories, including a story about mustard gas experiments on African Americans during World War II, for which she won a Murrow Award and a Peabody Award, and every other accolade you could bestow upon a great journalist. So I'm gonna move down the panel because, Jim, your film kind of seems like almost the perfect place to start, just because there's a work of journalism at the center of your story that seemed like ultimately it wasn't going for precise truth, but it was going for some sort of ecstatic truth about life in the United States in the 1960s. And why don't you just talk about that story in the Times, which is the thing? Yeah, let's start off with the clip. That sounds good. The trailer? Yeah, and why don't you speak into a microphone?
The trailer? Yeah, I guess maybe that will start.
Ladies and gentlemen, the trailer.
Audio? There's audio with it. Why don't we cut?
All right.
It's a silent film, and I've heard that there's new medium of talking pictures, so I'm really looking forward to that. But this was actually played. Usually, there's a live orchestra that accompanies this trailer.
Well, are we close here? Okay. So, but why don't you just talk about this New York Times story, because
Sure.
that is the crux of everything.
Sure. I'm just curious, how many people are familiar with the name Kitty Genovese? So that majority, and just as a quick primer, in 1964, the New York Times reported that 38 watched a woman being attacked for more than a half hour in Kew Gardens, Queens, and no one called the police. No one helped. And the woman, who was 28 years old at the time, her name was Kitty Genovese, and she became essentially the symbol for urban apathy. And the 911 emergency system that we all have is often credited being propelled by her murder, but so are Good Samaritan laws, neighborhood watch groups. The Guardian Angels credits its inspiration from the Kitty Genovese murder. The author of that story, so to speak, was Abe Rosenthal, who at the time was the city editor of the New York Times, and then became the executive editor, or essentially the editor-in-chief of the New York Times. And so this story was very much associated with the Times. The paper of record, all the news that's fit to print, essentially, and what the film unravels, based in 2004 when the New York Times questioned the accuracy of its original story. Kitty Genovese's brother, Bill Genovese, who is a double amputee as a result of that story, not just the loss of his sister, but needing to prove that he was not like one of those 38 witnesses, set off on a 10-year investigation to unravel what actually happened that night when the New York Times questioned whether that story might be true. And that is what the witness is. Cue clip. And so the film follows, so that's essentially the setup. But it does actually, and I think Franklin's right, it speaks to a central question of ecstatic. This was a, I don't know whether we should, do you want to actually, I have a question. Should we transfer to in case that it's something wrong with that particular clip, and then maybe Elise or Caitlin?
Yeah, sure. We could shift. Yeah, no problem. So, Elise, it seems like one of my segue between the two of you was that both of your films, in a way, are about resisting cheap moralism. I mean, I don't know if that's fair. It seems like it's pretty clear in the case of the Genovese film, which the Times was prosecuting this sermonizing view of the world where everybody was apathetic and that the world was going to hell. And that's what this case was a metaphor for that. And your documentary, my sense is that you have this kind of complicated character profile taking place in the shadow of all these tabloid headlines and a lot of the kind of cheap, the cheapest condemnation of Wiener. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that, first, this film was about following Anthony in this 2013 mayoral's race. Right. And you had this very complicated character, and we were talking about it earlier. He has this Shakespearean quality of being so self-aware, so insightful, and then just so blind. And you see that throughout the film, the sort of self-destructive quality play out. And so you have his arc through the film, and then you have this larger story. It's for us, it was about more than just one man or one campaign. It provided a look at our politics and how it's driven by entertainment and spectacle. You see how political coverage becomes defined by tweets and sensational one-liners, and I think that has some relevance right now when you look at our current presidential race in terms of
what gets covered and how it has just become about entertainment and theatrics. And you see that played out, that same story in the coverage of Anthony's story.
I don't know what moments we're going to see from the film, but there are moments in it that, as for a viewer, are just so painful to watch for some of the reasons that you described, which is that you're watching this guy who's like so self-aware, but he's not self-aware, ultimately self-aware, obviously. But also, it's just such an intimate portrait. And there are moments where you're sitting there watching him and Huma Abedin, his wife, go through the ringer. And it's, as a viewer, you kind of, it's like, you can't turn away, but it's a profoundly uncomfortable thing. Was it uncomfortable for you as a filmmaker kind of being there? And did you have any, I mean, it seems like there are moments where you've kind of, in the film, that are pretty interesting, where you draw a curtain and you decide, and Anthony says, don't go here, and you don't go there.
I mean, I think, so I co-directed this film with Josh Kriegman. Josh, my co-director, actually used to work in politics and worked for Anthony, which was how we got this, how he had this relationship. But the conversation in terms of getting access was over 2 years of, talking about trying to do a film with him. And then when he announced he was running, he allowed us to film. So Josh primarily did most of the filming with Anthony. That was a decision we made very early on. We had a lot of crew in the beginning, and it just felt that, first of all, there was a physical issue where it's like in the car, you could only have one camera, but then it also felt that...
So those instances, it's just Josh with the camera?
It's mostly Josh, yes. There were other moments, I was there throughout, but I was outside the room trying to get other stuff or in communications about story. But I think the footage that we had, you're absolutely right, it was this extraordinary access. And we knew, I mean, this scene, which I did bring, which is one of the most, I think, there are many moments, but really intimate, really painful moments, was after the sexting scandal broke. And we're in the room, and we knew we had this extraordinary material. And, it's not like some films or some stories, you're like, oh, there's no arc, there's nothing dramatic. Like, we had the opposite problem. We had so much sensational material. So it was like, how do we take the sensational material and not let it fall into just a sensational story? How do we take this and, yes, make it entertaining? We want to grab the viewer, but we want to have larger themes emerge.
But as a movie that, in some ways, privacy is, in the film, privacy is a theme. Right, it's an inherent theme, just because here's this guy who did this thing which he thought was private, but that then became public, and then his marriage, which was everything kind of divides, it straddles the line between public and private. Were there moments where, other than the ones that you left out of the film, where you were like, these are borderline cases where I'm ethically or morally or just even for the sake of kind of Anthony, you felt like you really wrestled with putting them in the film?
I think what we tried to do, it was the context that you put it in. I mean, what we wanted to do was show the human side of what it means to be at the center of a media firestorm. I mean, we see these scandals played out all the time. We see celebrity meltdowns, and what is it like to be in the room? What is that human experience? So we should just show this clip, and I can talk about it. So
cue the clip.
There are 2 clips, and I think it's the first one. This is right after the scandal broke, and I just would, this moment is what determines sort of our style for the film and our approach.
Could you move forward a little bit? If I do that, I'm going to lose my spot, so I'm not going to.
There you go. Has forgiven. Real messages are by far the most explicit ones we've seen. Okay. People are wondering whether she might show up today. The big question is whether the allegations are true and that this correspondence took place after he resigned from
You find Huma for me.
A major game changer.
In this same window of time, there was one other person. I said it was over an extended period of time. I never said it started here and ended here. Fuck. me. What number can they dial on?
Want me to dial them in?
No. Can you plan Huma back in, please, and then close the door and stay on the other side of it for a while? I don't mean disrespectful, but please leave me alone for a while. Do you know the timing of any of this?
No, I don't.
Not at all?
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
so we were talking about that separating. So where are we on the statement?
I can't get through to them on the telephone. We keep getting interrupted.
Okay.
They think that this is not gonna work. They think this is whatever. I don't know. I'm like very anxious about you and I being apart today. Someone's gonna find you.
Yeah.
Listen to someone on a effing phone.
Campaign office? No. Okay, Anthony's just trying to get you on. Okay.
Hi. Well, you're saying that the timeline is the problem, which I get. By the way, we're on the line. Okay, so go ahead. Obviously, look, this is a continuum of challenges in our marriage that ended at a certain point, and we decided to move forward with our lives, and that was a problem, and that's behind us. And as we said, other things would come out. No. We're getting, obviously, we're getting deluged. Well, my head is at try to sell this as something that people already know.
Hello?
You guys still there? Okay. Well. We just have the room for a second, you two guys.
Wow, it's so incredible. What's incredible? So, what you wanna unpack that a little bit?
I mean, I think there are a couple things to say about it. That, I was thinking about the various styles and approaches that you have to documentaries and the stories you tell. And for me, and I think for my co-director too, the story determines the form. And we had this verite experience, this experiential kind of approach that we wanted to let the moments speak for themselves and be authentic to the moment. It wasn't about, when I did this documentary with the trial of Saddam Hussein, it was interviews and experts that were guiding the story. And here, our approach was taking away the interview. We actually had an earlier cut. We had Anthony talking about it a little bit, and we decided that didn't feel true to the moment. And so we took it out. And so you realize that without saying anything, you're just having this silence, and it's speaking to the truth of that moment, of what it means to be in a media firestorm for a couple, what that feels like when you watch it out, what is behind the scenes. Yeah. And that was the truth that we were going for, which is allowing people to form their own opinions, to see the complexity of the relationship. And then the other thing that we did, which was a choice, was to insert ourselves at points. Yeah. There's this conversation about the ghost narrator, like in the film, where you sort of feel the presence of the camera, or you feel the presence of the author. And then when you feel it, you gotta let them know, we're here.
Well, it's especially since Anthony is so self-conscious about being filmed.
That's right. So we made choices throughout the film to include Josh's voice, to include our presence, to sort of say that we're creating this, we're bringing our own subjectivity, we're a part of the story too. I mean, Anthony's relationship with the camera is complicated, so it's a meta story.
Also, in that particular moment, I think you're very aware that he's dismissed a staffer and he's kept the camera. And presumably, I think there's a feeling, there's complicity between the camera, that somehow the camera is on his side or party to him. I think that's a very interesting dynamic that's introduced. So you are palpably aware of the existence of the camera and partly because the two central characters in your film have different comfort levels with the camera. But in that moment, you really are aware that we all, as the audience, have been allowed to stay in, and you're asking yourself why. It's interesting to just pick up on both of our films are about spectacle, and it's something you were talking about, how the impact of spectacle on narrative, on truth, and how they're ecstatic truths, as to pick up on the Herzog narratives. They are not factual, or the facts are then subverted in terms of fueling spectacle. Ours are separated by 51 years. The witness examines the half-century impact of a spectacle on a family. And we will have to revisit Anthony Weiner's family in 50 years to know the lingering effects, but you're seeing in real time, in sort of immediate time, how his family's being affected or impacted. And what was a very big surprise with the witness when I met with Genevieve's family was just how much the events, not just what happened, but the story that was told was a controlling factor in the lives of a family and many families for an entire half century. It didn't just end in a news cycle, and it continues to exert a hold on the family. What was done a half century ago by the Times still exerts a hold on many.
Yeah. Well, I mean, right. Why don't you guys just, since the question is ecstatic truth, just take a stab with each of your projects and describe, what it is. Was there an ecstatic truth that emerged from the stories? Because I actually find the term truth to be a little bit problematic in both of these instances, since in both instances you end on notes of just subtlety and complexity without really thinking that you have some firm grasp of an ecstatic truth. I think an emotional truths and a sense of the complexities of the human mind and of human motion and of human history, but I'm not sure that there was an ecstatic truth that emerged from either of these. Is that fair?
At the risk of being too esoteric or too, I don't want to stay with Franklin if you want to stay.
Let's just do this and then
So basically, look in your program, it refers to facts as earthbound, and truth is sort of some celestial, ecstatic thing. It's a wonderful launching point for a conversation, but it may be a little bit abstract in the sense that I think the paper of record, the first draft, it has a responsibility to the facts. In the Kitty Genevieve's case, A. Rosenthal took certain facts, ignored others, and the central fact that he ignored, and this is that Kitty Genovese died in the arms of a friend. Now, perhaps 3/4 of you have learned this case in a sociology or psychology class as 38 did nothing. But actually, she died in the arms of a friend. Somebody ran out in the middle of the night, down a back alley, having no idea who was outside, pushed her way inside a vestibule, having no idea who was on the other side, and there was Kitty, and she held Kitty, and Kitty died in her arms. That fact was known to the police, was in the accounts in the immediate aftermath, and that fact, she testified at trial. That fact somehow got eliminated. That alone subverts a narrative. Now, I think we could ask a question, and it's where the interesting earthbound facts versus truth. Does it matter if there were 38 or 3? Does it matter that 38 didn't watch, but if 38 heard, many heard her screams but didn't act, does it change? So how important are facts in your registering of the importance of the story? In this particular instance, had Abe Rosenthal written, 6 people may have seen, 12 kind of heard, and she died in the arms of a friend, would any of us know the name Kitty Genovese? I think we know the answer is no. And in that instance, I am making a film, I made a film, and I didn't set out, just so you know, this film, I was actually writing a film for HBO based on 38 Witnesses. And it was there that I met Bill Genovese and also learned that that story may not be true. And this person, and so I was interested in not a factual, I'm a filmmaker. I was interested in making a film about an extraordinary, and I know I say this at some peril, character. Not a person, but he is, Bill Genovese, is the living embodiment of loss. His wife has described him as missing a half of himself. Well, he literally is without both of his legs. He is the embodiment. And so I was drawn to this extraordinary character. And for me, he was doing the investigation. He was the journalist, so to speak. I was the filmmaker.
Let's have Caitlin weigh in here, because this is this is like the core of the journalistic project, which is that you have to make, when you write a story, you have to make choices about what to emphasize and how to reduce the messy complexity of human life into a storyline that reflects a thesis. With the first draft of history and all of that, and it's just, we know that it's kind of an imperfect pursuit. Why don't you just weigh in on some of the questions that Jim has posed that go to the core of kind of what you do on a daily basis?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think Jim is operating at the complete other end of the spectrum that I am, in the way that I think about stories, because I have to, especially newspaper stories. But I've done a little bit of what can fall in between, the ethical questions for a radio story. I worked at NPR for 5 years before I started at the Times. And the ethical responsibilities are different than they are for podcasts, than they are for newspaper stories. So there were so many interesting things that he brought up. When I talk about and think about this question of, sorry, I forgot, is it ecstatic truth? So, clearly, I don't like think about these sort of things in this way, or using that sort of terminology, but certainly think about them often. It's what do you include and what don't you include, and how do you get the information that you're getting. So one thing that I thought was really key, yes, about the Weiner clip was, and the point you brought up, did Anthony Weiner feel like the camera was on his side? And what were those discussions like to convince him that it was or that it wasn't? Because that affects the level of access that you get. And that's a huge ethical question where, I know what my negotiation would look like. And I've certainly been in a situation where a subject is asking me, almost every story, people say, what are you really getting at here? What's the goal? What's your angle? And my answer is always, I've just started reporting. I don't know what the story is yet. Do I have things that I think might come out in the process in the back of my mind? I do, but for a lot of ethical reasons, it doesn't make sense to put those out on the table early on, whereas, perhaps with a film, the negotiation is a little bit different. And you can say something like, I'm gonna be fair with you. I'm not gonna totally put you through the ringer. We're not trying to do a hit piece or whatever. People ask me all the time if I'm writing a hit piece. I don't even know what that is. But for me, I have to be really, guarded is not the right word, but really thoughtful about negotiating with sources in a way that is going to allow me to get a lot of information, but isn't going to be dishonest or isn't going to put me in a bind later where, my editor wants something and I'm thinking like, oh, well, I've already told this person that I kind of wasn't going to write. You just can't do that.
Because to go back to the primary Kitty Genovese question, which I know is something that I wrestle with as a journalist all the time, which is that I start off with a view of the world. Like Abe Rosenthal set off with the view of the world, which I'm sure was complicated. It's that, you know, we just came after World War II, where there were all sorts of questions about bystanders and people standing by while evil was committed. And there were all sorts of big questions that were unrelated to a murder that happened in Kew Gardens that were kind of informing the way that he thought about things. And it seems like a very human impulse, right? That's very hard to constrain. Is that something that you find that you wrestle with when you set out to do a story?
Certainly, and of course I'm going to say that, you know, I'm always willing to just totally blow up the view that I go into a story on, and, you know, it's really important to be able to push back on yourself and make sure that you're not allowing these preconceived notions of what you're getting into to hold back the final product, to hold back getting at the facts, to hold back, you know, what the right narrative is in service of the one that you want to tell because you think it's more compelling or you just believe it to be true. I do think it's a big part of my job to constantly push back against myself, to question the notions that I walk into a story with.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, you know, we're embedded with our subjects in many respects. I mean, my film took 11 years to make, and that's a long time to spend with a subject. And that embedding, we talk about embedding, and you guys, journalists here, obviously talk about the impact of embedding on the way you report. And so when you are that long with someone, there is a kind of pact that isn't even necessarily spoken.
That's right. A lot of it is unspoken, which is really key.
But also the threshold of I never felt that I had the obligation to show both sides. That notion of equal access. I did feel the obligation to question or check my assumptions.
Well, both of these projects kind of beg the question of where I'd say that you both embedded and you both adopted. You were both operating through the lens of a character. Yeah.
Well, no, but interesting because I have to imagine that Anthony Weiner seems less, from what I've read, less enamored with the portrayal of him, whereas Bill Genovese is an executive producer of The Witness. Now, I was the filmmaker. Bill Genovese narrates this film. That's very seldom when you. Most first-person authorial films are narrated.
At first, when you see that, because all of the primary questions that are begged by the title and the way that it's presented, all of the assumptions that you bring to it being a documentary are challenged when it's narrated from the start.
But I introduce it, a film by James Solomon, and then Bill Genovese is narrating a film that he's the center of, and that's. And so, in a sense, I'm owning the embedding. But don't ever forget, there is a filmmaker, although one of my artistic challenges and desires, objectives, was to bring the viewer as close and as intimate into Bill's reality as you possibly could. But I own his presence, and I think it's one, I suspect for you, at least it's been one of the really interesting challenges. How close were you and Josh worked within his narrative versus your personal connection or professional connection?
Well, I think all documentaries, all character documentaries, you see deal with this. It's a different form. I think there are some similarities. We all have to tell stories. And as you were talking about, inevitably when you need to tell a story, a good story, you need a beginning, middle, and end. There can be friction in terms of all the facts you can include. So there is, by its very nature, storytelling is a construction and reductive. And so I think that, you know, what you choose to lead with, what bites you choose to include. So I think that's a similarity in all storytelling. I think by its very nature, obviously, each documentary is also very different. You know, when I did the trial of Saddam Hussein, it was more traditional. It was an investigative piece. It was a traditional storytelling approach. And then with Weiner, the approach was more verite, experiential. We're taking the viewer on this journey through Anthony's experience. And then we inserted ourselves as documentarians in that story when we became a part of that story. we pose a question to Anthony because we know the viewer's wondering, how are you here? Like, and there's a question that we ask, why did you allow us to film this? Yeah. And we talked about that question being asked because we knew the viewer's wondering, and this is a meta story in the film. Anthony has a complicated relationship with the camera. In some ways, he's a person who comes more alive in front of the camera. It wasn't, and then, in terms of why he allowed us to film, at the end, so we did talk to him and interviewed him about 4 months after we filmed him and asked him to reflect on it. And he did say, I don't regret letting you guys film me. I just wanted to be viewed as more than a punchline. I think he had this experience in the first scandal of having his entire life just wiped out by this one thing. And there was a hope that with this film, that a more complex version of himself would emerge. And that was our intention. We wanted to show complexity. We wanted to show the realities behind the headlines. You see two different versions of the truth. Yeah. But he has, after the film, he hasn't seen, so it's different. He hasn't, what happened was, he was aware we were making the film and editing it for about 2 years. And then before we finished, we said, do you want to see the film? And he said, no. He said, I don't want to relive it. And we respected that. And so he still, I think, has not seen the film. And I think he has wanted to keep his distance from the film. And we can certainly respect that.
Let's just pause to dwell on that fact. Because in that scene that you just showed, where he's going through this unbearable act of humiliation and trying to, and his wife is in the room with him. It felt to me like he was emotionally connecting with the camera so much more than he was with his wife. And it's so hard to believe somebody with that sort of mindset couldn't, maybe he's just terrified of seeing the film.
I think he's heard a lot about the film, and people who his friends have confronted him, and there's been a range of reactions. Some people, and that's what we wanted. We wanted a range. Some people are like, oh my God, he's, I'm so disappointed he's not mayor, and they've told him that. And some people are saying, yeah, he's still got these serious problems. But yeah, as far as I know, he hasn't seen the film.
Go for it.
So the New York Times has seen the film, The Witness. Anthony Weiner has no responsibility to see the film. That is a choice, personal choice. I think the New York Times has, and it goes to ecstatic truth, narrative truth, earthbound facts. The New York Times has an obligation to retract the story that is incorrect. They never have. And
they published a 2004 version.
No, in which they raised some questions. And then in Winston Moseley, who murdered Kitty Genovese, died 3 or 4 months ago, in late March. And in the obituary, the New York Times, McFadden, who wrote the obituary, acknowledges grossly exaggerated. The story was grossly exaggerated. But the New York Times, as an institution, has never said, we got this story wrong.
Why don't we show the Gabe Pressman clip?
Well, yes, let's show it. And I am trying. I'm in the process of trying to get the New York Times to retract a story that's inaccurate. And this clip speaks to how. No, just play the clip. Oh, okay. Okay, so I think probably to save time so that others can speak, I would just show the clip when you guys have it up. But that's a story. So journalistically, I think that paper of record has an obligation, and I greatly admire the New York Times, and have read it, and a lifelong reader of the New York Times, still get the print edition. But if you got a story that wrong, you should retract the story. As a filmmaker, you don't need to retract, unless you're factually so irresponsible. But I think there's a different standard in terms of whether your earthbound facts are wrong.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, the contrast that you're setting out, and it's kind of the core question. I will not put you on the defensive and make you speak on behalf of the paper that you just started working for a week ago, a month ago. But the question is really an interesting one, that it takes the process of getting towards the actual facts of the thing, and the very roundabout process that it takes to make that happen. I'm just curious, Caitlin, is there an example in your own reporting where you found that you've had to go through that same sort of roundabout circular pattern of getting at the truth, like the same sort of moment where something that was conventional wisdom, just you've seen like kind of slip through your hands like sand in the same sort of way that this Katie Genovese story did over time, where this thing that was an established fact, commented on by every introduction to sociology class and every ethics seminar, and then suddenly you get that moment where conventional wisdom just starts to, and it's so hard conventional wisdom does not respond well to being assaulted in that sort of way.
I think it comes up all the time, and I think, the reason why journalists can be a little neurotic and just weird is because you constantly, if you're doing a good job, have to question everything that you're told, including, in discussions with family and friends. And, I constantly am catching up with family who I miss and haven't seen in a really long time, and I'm so excited to see, and they're sort of just sharing stories. People are saying X or people are saying Y, or what actually happens is that people often just in regular conversation say, this is happening, that is happening, as if it's fact, because it's something that they saw on Facebook, because it's something that everybody at school or work is talking about. It's maddening, and I want to correct everyone constantly, or ask them, where did you read that? Show me the article. I was in Chicago last year. I have a lot of family who work for the city government, including family who are police, and but we're in a different context now, but cousins and family who are police were saying to me, the police are just constantly being targeted, and people are going after the police, and it's so dangerous right now to be a policeman because people are going after them, and so many people were saying this to me, and I said, can you just, what specifically happened, or where did you read that, or can you show me an article? And none of them could. But it's just how humans work and how we communicate, because not everybody is a journalist. So, and then when it comes to doing a story that goes up against something that people have accepted as truth, this is one that drives me crazy, that I've done a few stories on. I tend to go back to the topic of immigration frequently, and politicians on every side of the aisle and every level of government, including the president, will refer to the line, will refer to, you got to get to the back of the line. If you're an immigrant, you can't jump and you've come to the US illegally, you can't cut in front of other people who are in line, who've been waiting to get visas and who've done things the right way. But there is no line. So this is just something that, because I cover immigration, I know there are very specific ways in which somebody can apply to immigrate to the United States. You have to have, a family member who lives here. You have to be somebody who can invest money into the economy. And there are these various categories. But if you don't fit into one of those categories, there's no line for you. So yes, I mean, but then you sort of bring it up, even in a pitch meeting at a very important news organization. I mean, this has not come up for me at the Times yet, but it did come up in the past, where even my editors would say, well, what do you mean that's, President Obama just said that. What do you mean that's not? And there's no line. So yeah, it comes up all the time, and then it's an uphill battle to sell your story. But those are the most important stories to do, even though you have to look like a crazy person on the way to convincing people, how key they are.
Go ahead.
I just want to say I appreciate that mind. I mean, it really speaks to me. I think that we all have to be doing that and be seeking truth, and and question assumptions. And it's so important. And investigative reporting is so important. And I think it's getting harder to do that. It takes time. It takes money. I mean, I remember people talking about Spotlight being Obama called it a piece of fiction. And I think a lot of it's a hard thing to do. And I think for me personally, I love investigative reporting, and that's where I started out. And what I love about documentaries is that I get to spend 3 years on a subject, really looking through the footage, really trying to wrestle with what are the fundamental facts, what are we trying to do here? You know, the Wiener film wasn't an investigative. That wasn't what we were going for. But I think that that line of inquiry, I just think is so important, you know, in all storytelling and in all ways of being, to just question what the assumptions are and to just keep on going it. And I think there is a way where you will never know, but that pursuit of it just feels like a very noble and important pursuit. It's why your character is so incredible to watch, and you just root for him and you just want to watch him because he is so driven for truth. And it's hard to find the truth. You don't know exactly, but that mission just feels such an honorable one.
Well, you know, it's interesting. It is almost as if there are two different, and this maybe reduces it too much, but in a sense, Caitlin's responsibility in many respects is to just keep hammering away with fact, with the earthbound fact, with knowledge. And the filmmaker sort of, because Yael's film, which is wonderful, and she was in the prior session, was talking about, he's sort of looking at the why we digest bullshit, why we believe our own bullshit, or why we, in a sense, not so much hitting always at the fact or the truth or the information or what's earthbound, but trying to understand the why, which is what is extraordinary about your film, Lise, and why it will be nominated for an Academy Award, is because it's examining this idea of the complexity of how we are lying to each other and not confronting him with fact. We're seeing him confronted with fact while we are understanding, because of your film, the person that is digesting this information. So it's almost watching journalism confront film. What Bill Genovese does, that he is this ultimate truth seeker in the film, and the clip is actually finally, I think it's ready, is what he does is he goes to journalists to find out, how did this story, how was it wrong? How did it become wrong?
This is Mike Wallace. Why did 38 people fail to act? The answer to that question concerns every one of us who fears perhaps that apathy has become part of our way of life.
The question becomes, was it worth all the attention it got, or was it a media creation?
Oh, I think to a certain degree it was a media creation. No one investigated the 38, no one followed up on it or anything of that nature.
Do you have any feel for why that would have been with this case versus any other case?
Because it was taken seriously by the New York Times. The reason I picked up on it was because Abe Rosenthal is a man I respect, good reporter, in a position of authority at the New York Times. I mean, the Times had, still does, but back then particularly, had the kind of clout. It's a fascinating, troubling story. And undoubtedly sold newspapers.
Hi, is this Mr. Lillefeld?
Yes, sir.
When did you start working at the Times?
I became a reporter in 1963, I guess.
Do you think the original Times story is accurate?
I remember feeling it was a little skimpy.
Yeah.
That it reached its judgment quickly.
Have you ever heard of a woman named Sophia Farrar?
No.
Sophia Farrar actually did go down to be with her as soon as she found out about it.
And did the police list her as a witness in their report?
Yeah, she testified in court.
And she's not mentioned in the Times story?
No.
No, well, that's inexcusable then. The question would be why the competition didn't look into it.
Hi, Richard Wald.
Speaking.
You were the managing editor at the New York Herald Tribune in '64?
Yeah.
Did the Tribune ever write a story about how the Times covered the story of 38?
No, I don't remember the Tribune ever doing that. Let's assume you were a reporter on the scene. If you had a sense that it didn't happen that way, I would have assigned people to go and check.
Right.
But I don't know any reporter who felt that way.
Mr. Pressman?
How are you?
Good, I'm good.
In 1964, I was a reporter at WNBC, and I had no firsthand knowledge of the story, but my friend Danny Meenan covered the story. Among all the police reporters I've known, and I've known many, he was one of the best, if not the best. He said, the story doesn't make any sense to me. And he gave me an account of what he found. And it says here there were many witnesses, some 30-odd in the number. One conclusion all seemed to have, it was a drunken brawl between man and wife. Martin Gansberg, the author of the page one story in the Times, which caused the furor, was challenged by this irate reporter. Why didn't you include in your story the fact that many witnesses did not believe a murder was taking place? Gansberg replied, it would have ruined the story.
So can I say something? I won't respond on behalf of the New York Times. I'm actually curious, you know, what you're hearing and who you're dealing with, because I am seriously very new. But I think the fatal flaw is very clear early on in that clip, which is, you know, Mike Wallace, why did you do the story? Because the Times did it and they had clout, and I trusted Abe Rosenthal. Well, that's, you know, I mean, that's just horrifying. You cannot trust anything that anybody says, and not to suggest that, you know, I don't make mistakes. I've got corrections on stories too, but of course, you know, the question should always be whether you're making, you know, whether you're Herzog and you're making a film and sometimes he decides, you know what, this isn't the truth, but I think I want to include it anyway because I find it compelling. That's fine, you know, that's his calculation versus mine, which would be that I don't have that option. But the question always has to be over and over and over and throughout the entire process, how do we know this? How do we know this? How do we know this? And the right answer is never because somebody told me. And it also, one thing that I've overheard that drives me crazy is, you know, I'll say, how do we know this? And the answer is like, well, we don't have any, how do we know this is true? And the answer might be, and again, I haven't encountered this at the Times because I'm new, you know, we don't have any reason to think it's not true. You know, which is, again, just so uncompelling for me and really kind of scary. But at the other end of the spectrum, you know, I do think as a journalist, I have some leeway and some options in terms of making artistic choices in the way that I put together a story, which is what we're here to talk about. You know, it's the challenge with balancing what the facts are with creating a compelling story. And there are definitely still, like, the meta questions that are presented in Wiener. I can do stories like that too. I mean, I did one documentary following a guy through kind of his immigration court proceedings, radio documentary, where throughout I'm in the story, and throughout the story I'm questioning, like I'm in there and I'm saying, like, I don't really know, you know, it had to do with his drug convictions and whether he was really a drug dealer versus whether he was just a recreational pot smoker, which was ultimately going to determine his case. And I'm in the story saying, like, I don't really know if I believe what this guy is saying. You know, you can do interesting things like that in journalism. You can even leave things out. You know, you mentioned leaving certain interviews out because sometimes, like, the emotion of the way that somebody delivers something or just writing something in an experiential way versus including quotes from experts that you got later. I mean, sometimes that can be, many times that can be even more evocative, even more truthful. I agree that truth is, you know, it's such a difficult and kind of unhelpful term. But so you can leave things out, but you can't leave out facts. You know, you can't leave out, like, well, this guy actually went to jail, and but that makes him a less compelling character, so we can't put that in the story. Of course, you can't go that far, but I just really enjoy the challenge of being asked to put together something that's really compelling, but that also doesn't stray from the truth in the way that Herzog has, you know, to great success. I just think it's a fun challenge to be up against.
Herzog went on to elaborate, because I looked him up, I looked him up to see what he said about truth, and particularly of ecstatic truth. And he goes on to say, and it picks up on the thread of what you just said, Caitlin, because I'm not sure I totally agree. I mean, I certainly agree with you in terms of the way we can move story around. But he says, quote, "There are deeper strata of truth in cinema, and there is such a thing as poetic, ecstatic truth. It is mysterious and elusive and can be reached only through fabrication, imagination, and stylization." And we certainly, the way you move stories around, you deal with time, the way you add music to sort of stylize. But as a journalist, I don't think you can take the kind of liberties. I think you really have to be earthbound.
The only option for me of those three is the stylization, the imagination, and the, what was it, fiction? Yeah, no. Those two options are not available to me. But certainly, like I was trying to say, I can ask meta questions, I can use style and still put together something that's really compelling. Like, to me, what I think of in that extended Herzog quote, he said, again, oh, the deeper truth. Well, I think about in interviews with people, and it's all related to the relationships that you have with your sources and what you owe them at the end of the day. Like, I find it really interesting that the main character was an executive producer on your film, and I also find really interesting the dynamics, including the unspoken dynamics between you and your co-director and Anthony Weiner himself, because a big, very central question to this discussion is, what do you owe your sources at the end of the day? And for me, the answer always has to be nothing. But this idea of a deeper truth, the way that I can apply that is in interviewing somebody when I ask them, what was it like to be secretly exposed to mustard gas when you were 17 years old and then not even being able to tell your parents or your spouse? Most people, their first answer is going to be bad. It was bad. Didn't enjoy it. It was awful. But if I develop a relationship with somebody and I spend days or weeks or months with them and get them to open up in a way that they wouldn't naturally, get them to be introspective about an experience in a way that they wouldn't naturally, I think I'm getting to a deeper truth there. I'm inserting myself in the process, but I think you can get to something deeper without having to make up, without having to spend hours with somebody and then me on my own try to distill, okay, what does this experience mean for this person? And then make up a quote, which is what Herzog might do. I think that you can still get to a deeper truth in that way.
What's remarkable about Elise's film and Josh's film is that they are acknowledging, without overstating, the presence of the filmmaker. And that is so much a part of the viewing experience. In a sense, when a newspaper reports a story, you see the byline, but you really don't see the sausage making. And what's happening in a way in Elise and Josh's film is you're seeing the sausage being made in a way, because there is that constant, in fact, if you break that wall, Josh asks a question. My film's called The Witness. That's in its title, this is a subjective experience. Now, many will say it's not called The Witnesses or the 38 Witnesses. It's called The Witness, and the subjective experience is Bill Genovese. Presumably, it's his investigation of his sister's murder. But I'm a witness on Bill. Yeah. And so in the title is the acknowledgement of a distorted reality. And I think one of the tropes of journalism is this notion of objectivity, but we sort of, as institutions, newspapers, we hide behind the institution because the correspondent or the journalist is a byline, but we don't really see how the sausage was made. So I, in a sense, can understand the subject who says to you, what's your angle? Because in a way, you're here and gone, and you're hiding behind, not hiding, but you're behind the institution.
I think we should show the other Weiner clip.
Sure.
And then we'll talk about that for a little bit, and then let's throw it open to questions. Do you want to?
What do you think?
I don't know.
You regret it? It's nice to jackass.
Has anyone ever told you it's hard to get you to talk about your feelings?
Let me ask you something. Are there any? There must be some species of fly that stays on the wall and talks, but I've never heard of one. Usually, is the fly on the wall technique? Isn't that have to do a little bit with the notion of not being seen or heard? You just kind of pick up what goes on around you.
Perfect.
I just got basically that exact accosting a couple days ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
By were you filming?
No, not. I wasn't filming. I was riding along with police officers, and of course, pitched them. I'm just going to be on a fly on the wall. You won't notice me. And then I'm like, a zillion questions, driving them crazy.
Well, I mean, I think this clip was about what I've already been talking about, this decision to have ourselves be a part of the story. I mean, we bookended the film with Anthony talking about the documentary. The first one opens with, shit, I can't believe I'm doing a documentary about my scandal. And then it ends with, I don't regret letting this happen, and I hope that it's more than a punchline and it doesn't get sucked up into the entertainment vortex. And we, actually, my earliest story construction of when I thought about it, I actually always sort of thought that would be the way it would go. Because Josh and I talked about, should Josh be more a part of the story and how do we do that? And but I actually think pretty early there were certain moments when we're like, maybe he should. Was like, no, the story is from Anthony's perspective. Is Josh didn't become, other than what you saw, like it was that ghost narrator idea. It's like, when are we here, and when are we a part of this? And we are. And the question of why he allowed us to film is a question that viewers are having, and it is relate to his psychology. He likes the camera. And so that was just this moment. And on the other hand, it also showcases, as this is a character study in some ways, this film, it showcases how he's so funny and self-aware. I mean, Anthony is so funny. He walks into a room and it's like all eyes are on him. He can make so many jokes. And he's just, and that's like this charisma. And then you see that in that moment too. And then you also see this other side.
Well, that moment is so perfect just because you're asking him, show us your feelings. And he says, I'm going to be funny and deflect with my humor. I would love, before we throw it open, I'm just so curious, given everything that happened in the last month with Anthony and his marriage, and to what extent was that something that you could, is that the coda to the narrative that you built in the film, or does it in some ways undermine the narrative in the film?
I think it's a coda. Yeah. I think that, you see the sort of tragic element in the story. You see the way in which the marriage has tension. And the film is a bit open-ended. You see Anthony and Huma walking down the street. She's on her phone. You don't know what's going to happen. And actually, the events that have happened right now, you see where Anthony has gone. It's to a much darker place. He still is engaging with self-destructive behavior, and his marriage has ended. So the film has a more tragic element, but that tragic element was in the film. Yeah. And so these latest events just sort of reinforce it.
The level of self-destruction exposed by the recent events, it's just, you knew he was self-destructive, but I guess even I was kind of, after seeing the film, was surprised by the level of self-destruction there. But
I think so were we.
Yeah.
I definitely, I think it's been, especially the latest round has been very disturbing and surprising. But then again, that's a part of his personality. Yeah. Just time and time again. At the end of our film, I was at Election Day, and I don't know if it's like this crazy moment where he's being chased by his,
it's amazing.
by his pineapple, by his virtual mistress, and she's chasing him, and they get him so that he gets to do his speech, and it was a good speech. Like, he actually had this moment. Okay, you're there, and then when he's pushed down the stairs, he gives the middle finger, and it's just, and he says it. He says, I don't know why I have this unlimited ability to mess up things. And in that moment, it's like he just had that self-destruction.
What do you think is going to happen to him?
I don't know. I think we'll see. I don't know if these latest round of allegations are true. We'll have to see. Yeah.
All right, so why don't we open it up for broader discussion? Yeah.
The Herzog quote that you mentioned, it reminded me of the Snowden, and I've seen both the documentary and the Oliver Stone. And my question is that since Snowden is still an important subject, I wonder about Oliver Stone fabricating, to use your Herzog quotation, and what, I don't know how to evaluate the Oliver Stone film if it has fabrications in it.
Well, I mean, I don't know if anybody feels equipped to weigh in on that, but I mean, I do think that there is this question, and we can see a continuum here in the two films that we have of the verite method, which is just you're there, this camera, there's the narrative is being shaped, but it's kind of done in a imperceptible, kind of light-handed sort of way. We have Jim's film, your background in feature films, and the way in which you script it, and you have a very heavy footprint in the film. And then there's this third layer, which is that we could go even further in terms of kind of the way in which we take the real events and we rearrange them, which is to actually fictionalize them, which is what Oliver Stone did. Why don't you start off talking about your decision to go from feature to documentary?
I actually felt that there had been enough fictionalizing of the Kitty Genovese murder. It has been chewed on by everyone but the people who are most deeply and profoundly affected by it, starting with her family, who had remained silent for a half century, but also we hadn't heard from any of the witnesses. So Bill actually, in the course of his 11 years, tracks down the witnesses who were in the apartment, the journalists who covered the story, the killer, and then most importantly, and why in a sense this film is really a love story, he reclaims his sister's life, her real life, from her infamous death. We only know about her last 30 minutes. So that's, but having not seen Oliver Stone, but this particular film, but obviously being familiar with Oliver Stone's work, at this moment in time, knowing Oliver Stone's work and his body of work, I don't think anyone who goes into a film of his would assume that it is, it may be factually inspired, but it is not authoritative factual truth. But that doesn't make his subjective interpretation of the art any different. What I had to do, though, because I am a screenwriter, I also wrote a movie called The Conspirator, which Robert Redford directed, about the Lincoln assassination, sort of a story that we think we know, but the story behind that story. It premiered actually at Ford's Theater. But that was similarly a scripted enterprise. I had to, in a sense, surrender myself, and that meant 11 years, surrender myself to a reality that I could not control. So I was making a film about Bill's investigation, and I had to be patient. Now, I do have narrative training, structural training, but I was making a film about my background, the films that inspired me, the person whose work greatly inspired me was Sidney Lumet. I'm from New York, and it was of that era. And Bill Genovese is Serpico, or Frank Galvin in The Verdict. He is a scripted character, or if only we were so lucky to have a scripted character like that. So I am thinking about him, that's why I said at the beginning, I'm thinking about him as a character, but I can't change the facts of his life. I can't recast his wife. Well, I wouldn't want to, she's amazing, or his children. In assembling, in stylizing, I am using all the devices that I possibly can summon to tell the story. And we are also the beneficiaries, Elise probably more than anyone, Elise and Josh. We would not be sitting here so consumed and fascinated about Anthony and Uma if it weren't for what journalists had done and having created this extraordinary spectacle. And having shown at the same theater, and I said this to Elise before, I showed at IFC all summer, the great independent film theater in New York. Started 6 times a day, then went to 4, then went to 3, then went to 1. Her film, which predated mine by a couple weeks, was 6 times a day, every day for the entire summer. And I would sit outside, and I will use this opportunity to do the same thing. I sat outside when the people who were at her screenings would come out and say, do you like documentaries? And typically I would get an answer, often, kind of. They had just come from a documentary, kind of. So you're thinking, why are you here? Well, they're not here because they are documentary aficionados. They're here because it's a good time, it's a fascinating, it's a spectacle. And I would try to talk them in to going to see this movie. Now, as I went from 6 to 4 to 3 to 1, I wasn't as effective as I hoped, but I basically would try to poach people on not going into the theater, but as they came out. And why were we there? Why are we so consumed? And by the way, it isn't Anthony's access that we're really interested in. We're wondering, what the was Uma thinking? That's what we're actually asking. So anyhow.
Let's hear the question to that. The answer to that question.
Okay. I can tell, but I have a lot to say. But in terms of Huma, that is right. I think people often ask about why did she allow you to film? And I think, she agreed to this documentary and participated throughout filming. I can't speak exactly to her reasons. She was never explicit with it. But what I do think is she felt that she was ridiculed and judged in a similar way to Anthony. I mean, especially about being a woman at the center of this firestorm. She was criticized for staying in the marriage. She was criticized for being at that press conference. And she is much more quiet and reserved, and she's camera shy. She's the opposite to Anthony. But I think she did share some of his desire of wanting a more fair and complete story told. But our access and relationship was more with Anthony, so you do see her, but it's not as much. So I think people are left wondering about her, but that's my sense of her.
Her face is so expressive.
Yeah.
And there's so little, she's not very good at concealing everything that's kind of roiling underneath the surface.
But I did want to say, I think, your story about IFC, which is, I think that documentaries, and this is like a documentary kind of conversation, which is, they sometimes they're films, they're films. And I think that sometimes people get confused and they say, I don't want to see a documentary because there's been tradition of documentaries being boring and feeling like medicine, but really they're films, and you have a film, and I think that they're and we want to tell a 3-act structure, and we want people to see our movie and then be entertaining, but we want to tell larger themes and important themes. So I think that's why I know a lot of documentary filmmakers, and I include myself. We say we're storytellers first, and I mean, in terms of my relationship, I do believe in fundamental facts and that being and shaping the story, but we are trying to tell a story. And I think there's parallels. You're trying to tell a story too. You want to bring people in. You want people to stay. And there is, it's been said, or maybe said, plot is the enemy of truth. And I think there can be this tension between telling a good story and relaying all the facts. You can't relay all the facts, but you can strive for a kind of truth.
Sorry, just related, was the witness, do you think, held back in any way by, I'm obsessed apparently with this question of what you owe your sources, and do you think that your plot, your storytelling, without having seen the film, which I should admit to, but I don't want to, immediately after, it's where I'm going, but was it held back in any way by the main character being part of the editing process, being an executive producer?
So he wasn't part. It's actually, I'm glad you bring it up. He was not part of the editing process. He was not the filmmaker. He was the subject of the film. He
did not weigh in at all in terms of what was included and what wasn't included.
He was. I showed him the film, and he gave feedback. But he did not have any no cut or whatever. But it's an interesting question. It was his investigation, and I come back to that. So, as my background is in journalism, and I would have done the investigation differently. There are people I would have asked or wanted to inquire of, and we had communications, but ultimately the questions asked, the way he engaged with Mike Wallace or others, that's Bill.
It's just a technical question. So in the film, he uses whiteboards and bulletin boards, and there are other, were those his own devices, or were those things that because they're so well integrated and so well used? You know, part of me watching it wondered whether you had a hand as a narrative device to direct him that way.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the film, a lot of any investigation is documents, right? So how do you externalize documents and photographs? And so the film has animation in it to animate his investigation. That is clearly a filmmaker's. The boards that Bill set up in his home, he's aware of what goes on in films. He lives in the reality of filmmaking and television, and so he's using the ways of gathering information. So to the extent that he's affected by what he's seeing out there and shaping how he gathers information. But, it would be lying, it would be dishonest to say that we don't have to have our characters wait for camera in some respects, or to set up. We're not inside their home. So on the days that Bill was doing his investigation, there were days when he probably was waiting for us to show up. So he lives 2.5 hours from where I live and where my crew is. So, there is a artistic enterprise at work.
I'm just curious about what each of you are working on now, and then in how much the kind of stylistically what you were able to so successfully mine out of these projects you're going to carry forward with you into your next ones.
I can't speak too much about the next project, but I definitely feel like some of the things that we were exploring, and actually some of the conversation we're having right now, is very much a part of the next project we're working on. I don't want to say any more than that.
It's Edward Snowden.
I'm writing a limited series, 8 or 10 hour series for TNT about the San Francisco earthquake in 1906 and the corruption trials that took place back then. And honestly, to listen and observe better, I think there are so many scenes that took place in The Witness that I couldn't possibly have imagined, and conversations and turns of narrative, and that trope again, reality is more, truth is stranger than fiction. It, in a sense, and to be more patient for a reality. As for, I think, and this is not unimportant. I made a film about a brother who lost a sister. In the course of making that film, my only sibling died. And I learned from Bill how do you deal with loss in good and bad ways. And so, much more importantly, the experience of making the film and being with a man like that who is overcome so much has shaped me than any film making or narrative experiences. But that's true about anything anyone does, regardless of whether you're a film, it's, if you're immersed in something, it changes or transforms the way you live your life. And that then, of course, affects your art.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all. This has been really stimulating to hear you tackle these questions. My name's Ted Braun. I'm going to be on a panel this afternoon. One of the things I was struck by is the relationship between this sort of ecstatic truth question versus the fact-bound question, and the ways in which the characters who are the subjects of your films, which I have not yet seen but deeply want to, the way in which the characters, the subjects of the film, sort of carry this impulse towards truth. I mean, you've talked about it very explicitly, Jim. Elise, were you conscious of that in some way or another, or was, I sense not, that Anthony's sort of drive in this film, at least as you explore it, had less to do with truth and more to do with his reputation and establishing it or reestablishing in some way or another. Do you think that this has some bearing on our readers and viewers' appreciation of where the truth lies? And Caitlin, you know, when you're doing a print story or a radio story, I think those of us listening to those stories or reading them have a kind of identification with you, the author, as a pursuer of truth and a relationship. Do you find yourself looking, you know, when you're putting together a story, for characters who are after the truth in some way or another, or do you feel that's a responsibility you carry and that readers are going to be following that? So,
Would you have something first? Yeah, no, I think it can be one or the other. I mean, I'm always, yes, searching for the right character to carry the story along. And sometimes, you know, this is sort of a forthcoming audio documentary that I think NPR might publish, but I have been in the situation where there's a person who's both a character in the story, but who's also had a role. And to a certain extent, the soldiers who were exposed to mustard gas had their experiences. They were kind of their own mini investigations where they had, you know, gone on these searches to find the records of secret tests that they were a part of, then identified them through all these complicated means, then gone back and forth with the US government for decades. And so there have been ways in which the characters in the story can serve as the investigator, and then the burden falls less on me if I like the way that they've done their work and I feel that it's comprehensive. But I'm always looking for, you know, the people who are going to be most expressive, most open, most reflective about the experience that I'm writing about, and wherever they fit, whether they're like the most obvious protagonist or whether they're some sort of, you know, a neighbor who lived next door to this big event that I'm writing about, who really has no role other than that she sits out on her porch every day, and so she happened to observe the thing. You know, it could be anybody, but I just try to be really open to finding the best person and then work with, you know, whatever their role was. Oh, and can I answer the previous question, which I didn't because I should do my plug, which is, I mean, so I've just joined the Times national desk where I've got like an enterprise beat, so I will be doing a lot of stories about immigration, other topics as well. I think this discussion relates most to bigger stories that I can't talk about that I'm nursing for like the magazine or podcasts, but there will be opportunities, and I think more and more, not just the Times, but everybody in journalism is trying to figure out ways to take more advantage of the art that can go into storytelling, the style that can go into it, the thoughtfulness around which you make decisions about what to include and what not to include, at the same time, hopefully getting rid of any of these impulses that influenced, you know, your story, where you decide to write about something because somebody told you to. I mean, I was never around for that era of journalism, and I hope not to be. So we're moving in that direction, but the one space at the Times that we're going to do that is this team that I have joined that's focused in particular on writing stories, doing films, doing podcasts about people of color and about the experience of people of color in the U.S. It's called Race Related, very on the nose. So sign up for our newsletter and look at those stories, because I think you'll see a lot of us playing with these different forms and these different approaches that will feel, hopefully less dry, more artistic, more compelling.
In terms of the question you were saying, I think that in terms of characters, one of the things that makes your character so fascinating and my character so fascinating is that they, the fundamental fact that they were both people, like the man on the mission. Anthony, your character was trying to find the truth. My character was trying to become mayor. And so there's like a natural story arc in that, which makes for a compelling movie. And I think as documentarians, especially what we wanted to do, I wanted to do a verite film before I even found Anthony. I was working on another story and what I was doing was following a character as the events were unfolding. It's a story in motion. And so that was the goal that we set out to do, to watch Anthony try to achieve this goal of becoming mayor and just being there. And then we also had him and his character and wanting to explore the complexity of his character. And, when we started out filming this, we thought 6 weeks in, he was at the top of the polls. He could have been mayor. And then the story changed, and our film, from a narrative perspective, changed. But that goal, that story intention stayed the same.
And structurally, you had built in a clock. And so you have an election, and he's running for election. The challenge often when you're making a film about a subject that isn't embedded, isn't tied into a clock, there is no, it's not a spelling bee, and we're going to have a winner. It's not a tournament. In this, you had an election. And I think my 11 years is in large part a function of a lack of clock. In a sense, it was the subject's mortality that was dictating how long this film would take.
He had a personal obsession that was about achieving a state of emotional catharsis that is almost impossible to...
And the only clock, and it's a clock that Caitlin confronted in her Peabody-winning pieces, is the clock of the individuals who are going to die if you don't get to them in time. And if they don't... So in a sense, the people you're documenting are World War II veterans who are in their 70s and 80s, but there's still a justice that they deserve, even though they're going to their mortality. So it is structurally, screenwriters, we cut right to it. We get into scenes as late as we possibly can, and we get out as early as we can. And you can screw with time. With documentaries, we are beholden to time, and sometimes we're wise, like Elise, to pick a subject that has a built-in timetable, so we're not, and that was the question I asked myself always, is this film going to be over?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's exactly right. When you're doing verite film, I was working on a criminal justice story, and it can't end until we find out more what's happening with the case. So you are beholden to the events. Yeah.
I think we're beholden to time here as well, and we're over. But I just want to thank you guys. I'm sure as a bunch of, it's a documentary film festival, so I'm sure you've seen these two extraordinary films. But if not, I'll be waving the placard on their behalf outside the theater, because they're both really, really extraordinary films. And thank you, Caitlin, and thank you all.